So the lockdown is technically over. Recording this the day after it should have gone out. The lockdown is technically over, and Boris Johnson won his vote, but at a cost. An embarrassing rebellion, 55 MPs, and many more abstentions. Some of which very serious people in the Conservative Party, the kind of people who aren't known for jumping on the rebel train. Suggesting that he's probably pushed things to his limit, and that further attempts to push things might backfire. And only that after making a huge effort to try and placate his own party, promising them all kinds of things which, frankly, I'm not convinced he's actually going to go through on. Promising them a February review, promising them that they will need to renew the legislation on February is in law, he can't avoid that. And the review on the 16th to see if he can move some areas from Tier 3 to Tier 2 is also in law, and he will have to do that, but he won't have to move anything down. And he's not given any binding commitment, although he has indicated that he's willing to look at so-called granularity issues, which is, of course, just basically going city by city, or borough by borough in London's case, instead of region by region. And the reality is, of course, that while that is a good idea in theory, the reality is that people who are frustrated and fed up with the lockdown will be inclined to do COVID tourism, where they just nip along to the nearest area that's in Tier 2 to enjoy some of home comforts. And as far as I can see, going through the legislation, the statutory instrument, there's not actually a rule against that. There's a rule against businesses opening, but there doesn't seem to be any onus on people for using services and attending venues. The rules, as in the statutory instrument, are against gatherings, and presumably if someone goes on their own, that doesn't qualify as a gathering if you are attending a service or a venue as an individual. But my thinking on this is that really, I'm just amazed that things have gone this far without things getting really nasty. And the fact that we are now in a situation where, how shall I put this? In a situation where the lockdown is effectively going to continue for large parts of the north of England and for parts of the Midlands. It's effectively going to just keep going on. Well, I think people will snap. I'm not convinced people will last till February 3rd. We saw things get pretty nasty before, and I don't think the metaphorical release valve of being able to go window shopping is really going to do much. On top of that, consider this. There's some really unpleasant connotations when you look at the long-term dynamics of the consequences of the lockdown. The greatest generation is what people used to call, the generation that fought the Second World War. And it occurs to me that these are people who lay down their lives to protect their children's way of life. In huge numbers, soldiers went off to war and died, young men, so that their children and their children's children could enjoy a particular way of life. The freedom to protest, for example. But just life in general and the way people are free to go about and do things. And here we have a situation where their children, the boomers, well, in order to save their lives, their children have sacrificed their way of life. And of course, tragic as every loss of life is, and on average about 10 years per death, that's a lot less than the 20 and 30-year-old soldiers who went off to war in the Second World War. I think that the ramifications could get pretty unpleasant. Here we're already seeing the high street dying. Debenhams has gone bust. The Arcadia Group, which is Topshop and a number of other retailers, is falling apart and may go bust. Our city centres are on the verge of being gutted. Our nightclubs are being closed. Our cinemas are talking about closures. The things that people enjoy in their daily lives, the things that they do between 5 and 9 when they're not working, they're collapsing, they're falling apart. And our pubs, which frankly, I've not been a big pub man myself, but I understand the appeal for some people. In certain areas, it can be the most community that they really have is a pub, and that is on danger of collapsing. All of these village pubs, how are they going to survive? And the help that the government is offering is really a pittance. It occurred to me more than anything else that the government has been playing favourites with industries and with regions. And particularly, we heard alleged in the House of Commons over and over again people saying that they'd heard reports that Boris Johnson had personally intervened to keep London out of Tier 3. And I believe there is a social contract that the government has entered into, whether it accepts it or not, by locking down much of the north of England and many other places, which is that they have an obligation to put our way of life, our culture, our venues, our art venues, our museums, our libraries, our galleries, our nightclubs, our pubs, our high streets on life support to make sure that while this is all over, they come back. And if they don't, the invoice will come. The North, particularly, will demand its Danegild, its lump of flesh. And that conflict doesn't end with lockdown. The angry voices, the protests, the smashing of bottles, the buffeting of police, it doesn't end with lockdown if the government doesn't do that. If the government doesn't underwrite the losses of lockdown, the cultural losses of lockdown, particularly for the north of England, they can expect a very harsh time of it, and frankly, they deserve it.